What is statistics? Statistics is collecting and interpreting data in order to make decisions. Data can be anything, coming from counts, measurements, responses, and observations. Population is the collection of all outcomes coming from all the responses, measurements, counts, and observations. A sample is a subset coming from a population. The difference between a population and a sample is that a sample is more easier to collect the data. More statisticians would prefer to use a sample rather than a population. Descriptive statistics is data based on calculations, graphs, and tables. Whereas inferential statistics are predictions about a population based on the calculation. A parameter is a numerical description of a population. A statistic is a numerical description of a sample. Journey. Do you know the difference between qualitative data and quantitative data? Qualitative data can be anything expressed as a number. Quantitative data cannot be represented as examples of quantitative data can be socioclass and gender. Examples of qualitative data can be test scores and measurement. Discrete data can be countable and quantitative. Continuous data cannot be countable but can still be measured. There are 4 different levels of measurements. Ratio being absolute, 0. Interval being the distance between has meaning, ordinal being put in and order, nominal being put in numerical order. Step 1 of designing a statistical study is identifying the variables of the focus. Step 2 is developing a detailed plan for collecting the data. Next is collecting and describing the data using technology to support your work. After, you would then interpret the data and make any assumptions about the population, such as, are there any outliers in the study? The last step would be identifying any errors in the study. There are 2 different types of statistical studies: observation and experiment. During an observational study, the researcher observes and takes measures of the characteristics of interest, but does not change any existing condition. Whereas in experimental statistical study, the researcher applies a treatment to one group and doesn't give a treatment to the next group. They then write down their responses from their observation. An example of an experimental statistical study would be the effect of eating oatmeal on lowering blood pressure. And an example on an observational study would be observing 4th graders solve a puzzle. There are 2 different types of data collection: a simulation and a survey. A simulation is using a physical model to recreate the conditions of a certain situation. A survey is the investigation of the characteristics of a population. Three key elements in producing an unbiased and a meaningful experiment would be control, randomization, and replication. The confounding variable is when the experimenter cannot tell the different effects on the factors on a variable. The placebo effect. The placebo effect is when a subject reacts favorably to a placebo when the subject has not been given the treatment. The Hawthorne effect. The Hawthorne effect is simply when the subject changes their behavior simply because they know they are being observed. A census is a control or measure of the entire population. It is costly and difficult to perform. Rather than sampling is a count or measure of a part of a population, which is usually less costly. A frequency distribution is a mathematical function demonstrating the number of outcomes a possible variable may have. Organizing data, we should be looking for a midpoint, which is the class mark, a relative frequency, and a cumulative frequency. To calculate the midpoint, you have to add the lowest class limit and the highest class limit together and then divide by. The relative frequency is the percentage of data that falls in the class. The cumulative frequency is the sum of the frequency of the class and all the previous classes. Quantitative data sets include a stem and leaf plot, a two-row stem and leaf plot, a back-to-back stem and leaf plot, a pie chart, a Pareto chart, and a scatter plot. These data sets are quantitative data sets, not only due to the fact that they have the ability to include the original data values, but because they're easier to sort data.